In 2020, after being charged by the Board of Trustees of the Unitarian Universalist Association, an Article 2 study commission was convened. For those who do not know, Article 2 is a section of the UUA bylaws that discusses the 7 principles, which also includes the sources, the purposes of the UUA, an inclusion statement, and closes with a section on freedom of belief. Now, we're not going to take time this morning to read through all of these slides, but we wanted to orient you because this is a huge deal in the denomination that's happening right now, and we have an opportunity to give feedback up until April 30th. Delegates who go to General Assembly will have an opportunity to participate in May as well as in the meetings in June, but the rest of us only have through April 30th. And bylaws, which I never would have thought perhaps in earlier days, are spiritual work. Or at least they can be. The documents that we use to guide our lives, how we organize ourselves, matter. They tell other people and ourselves what we value. So there will be some slides that will be read and other slides that will just kind of go by too fast. Don't worry about it. Just breathe through that. We'll also have some stuff available in circuits so you can orient yourself to other sources too. So you can see on this slide a quick overview of the current proposed changes, right? On the left-hand side is how that Article 2 reads those sections, and with the little arrows show you what the order, where they moved to in the new proposed changes. C 2.1 through 4 becomes C 2.1 through 5. This is what the current page looks like in the UUA bylaws. Now, I don't expect you to read that, obviously. I don't even think people on Zoom could probably read that. But this is what it looks like when you're looking at the PDF of the bylaws. Article 1, which is about the name. Article 2, which is the principles and purposes. And the beginning of Article 3, which is about membership. We read this part, the principles and the sources, at the beginning for our chalice lighting. Just below that, in C 2.2, is the statement of purpose of the UUA. And in the next column at the top are the statement of inclusion in C 2.3 and the freedom of belief in C 2.4. That C is important, and it's a signal from the consolidation, sometimes known as the merger, that happened between the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America, which merged or consolidated to form the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1961, and it wasn't even Ernie who said it out loud. 1961. For those of you who are new, Ernie Hall is our resident historian and knows all kinds of things about our Unitarian Universalist history. 1961 is when that merger, that consolidation happened. Now, you might be wondering, why the heck does this matter? Why are we talking about this on a Sunday morning? A few years ago, the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, created a Commission on Institutional Change. That Commission on Institutional Change, also known as the COIC, we do love our abbreviations, was convened to examine how racism impacts our structures and what can be done about it to help dismantle it. Increasing transparency for how things work is one of the recommendations. And governance is an actual important part of how we organize as a denomination and as a congregation. The more we understand how things work, the easier it is to participate. And to know our history helps us not repeat it. Potentially. That way, in this living tradition, we get to continue to grow and transform, just as our organizations and our denomination continues to grow and be transformed. Now, we have a version of 1961, Article 2. You may notice some things right away for those of you who can read it. There are only 6 principles. And maybe some language challenges. Yeah. 1961. And for a little context, this building was inaugurated later that same year. We use this phrase, living tradition. That means that we do not have a creed set in stone for all of time, but rather that we grow and change as we engage in a responsible search for truth and meaning. And in that change, so changes Unitarian Universalism. Now, I kept saying the C bylaws are harder to amend. That was by design. Because we are a living tradition, even in our governance, in bylaw C 15.1.C.6, it says, if there has been no study of Article 2 in the last 15 years, the board appoints a commission to study Article 2. We have it built into our structures to re-examine who we are at least once every 15 years. Now, it has not always happened. Bylaws are sometimes like that, but it has happened periodically. So in 2020, the UUA board did just that and appointed a commission to study Article 2. And when they issued their first report, it was a bit startling to many of us who read it. Some very significant changes were being considered.
So the first time that I ever went into a Unitarian Universalist building, it was the middle of the week, and it was really quiet. I perused the pamphlets, and I picked up a card that had the 7 principles printed on it, and I was amazed how they resonated and how I felt inspired by them. And then I flipped the card over and I read through the sources. And I felt so grateful at their expansiveness, at their inclusiveness, because I had left a faith tradition that taught that everyone in the whole world needed to believe the same thing. And I could no longer believe that. I didn't know that I would ever be able to be part of a religious community again. And so right there in the foyer of the Corvallis Fellowship, I became a convert to Unitarian Universalism. So when I learned that the Article 2 Study Commission was suggesting changing these principles and sources into something entirely new, I took it a bit personally. Maybe you feel that way too. Or maybe this morning's chalice lighting was the first time that you've ever heard the principles. Or maybe you don't have any particular attachment to them. All of these feelings are present right now throughout the denomination, along with the I don't care, like all of that. Delegates who have attended General Assembly for the past couple of years have heard presentations from the Article 2 Study Commission, or the A2SC, as they've come to be known. You may have heard that the UUA has offered several invitations to participate in this process, just as there have been other times to participate in the democracy of our denomination. And we all have different responses to those invitations.
In 1985 and 86, because it takes 2 General Assemblies to pass a change to a C bylaw, sources were added to the principles section. Transcending mystery and wonder and humanist teachings and God's love, all those things, they were added to the principles section, and some of the 1961 language was moved to new sections. We give profound thanks to our friend and colleague, the Reverend Cynthia Landrum, who serves a congregation in Massachusetts, who created several of the technical slides to help us all understand the importance of our history and to help make sense of what changes are being proposed right now so we can make informed choices when we send our delegates to Pittsburgh in June. We know you may not be able to read every word on these screens, and that's okay. Mostly, I want, for those of you who can see color, we want you to notice the color coding. The 1961 to 1985, what has changed, what has been moved, what's been reinterpreted, what's longer or shorter. Some of the ideas in the second and fifth principles from 1961 are now moved to other parts. Number 2 of the sources, number 5, etc. These were big changes in 1985. Folks who had been around longer than that were feeling a little bit of concern that these words were changing and maybe they would become a creed. Some people are still concerned about that. But the world had also been going through some big changes too. Language was becoming more inclusive. Thank you, feminism and others. There are other huge conceptual and theological shifts here as well. Now we know change can sometimes be hard. We can feel disoriented or confused. We can feel hurt if loss is involved with the change. We can also feel a sense of anticipation, though, with change. Maybe even eagerness. We might even be joyful if the change will benefit us or someone we love. Gil Rendell, who is a consultant for congregations of many traditions, notes a cogent response to the assumption that people fear change, or that people don't like change. We hear it a lot, right? People are just afraid of change. And then we just kind of go on with the conversation. But Gil Rendell reminds us that people actually are not afraid of change. We're afraid of loss. We're afraid of loss. We know this to be true once we interrupt the assumption, right? We're not afraid of change. Typically, when it changes, we welcome maybe the birth of a grandchild or flowers delivered on your doorstep, chocolate, an error that results in doubling your IRS refund. This week's a deadline, don't forget. We are afraid of loss. If I believe this now, will I still belong here? If governance changes, can they still have a voice? If you work to become a feminist, anti-racist white man, what happens when you're not in the center anymore? Fear of loss. There's been a global pandemic that we are still trying to find our way out of. And everything is different now. And we have lost so much. Some of those changes have been good for the planet and for us. Others have been painful.
We know that change happens all around and within us, and we don't have to look any further than the church gardens for lots of examples. Just since last week, the warm spring weather has brought out more flowers and green, green, green. There was no green in the trees last week. At this time of year, we tend to notice what is growing. But we know that change also includes losses as well as growth or new life. Sometimes those changes happen slowly and sometimes really abruptly. A couple of years ago, there was a storm with lots of wind and rain, and a tall oak tree that had been leaning fell across the backyard, hitting some of the other trees as it fell. The loss of that tree changed the backyard. Sunlight filters through differently now. There's more open space where the tree used to be, and the Japanese maple that is near the memorial garden lost a couple big branches. Randy Jennings worked hours and hours, days and days to cut the fallen tree and remove the wood. Thank you, Randy. We watched the shape of that tree change as the smaller branches were trimmed first, leaving the large trunk for last. Much of the wood was cut and stacked for firewood. Those logs will be burned and they will change again. Allison Dubray asked if she could bring 2 large pieces of the trunk to her uncle, Michael Burrows, who is a woodworker. Their family has a long history with this church, and now Allison's daughter Miranda loves to play in the garden and climb in the trees. Her uncle generously used his talents and his tools to transform the blocks of wood that had been the tree trunk into these beautiful bowls, with the intention that they can be used in worship or other aspects of congregational life. One of the bowls has some cracks, as that piece of wood cracked as it dried. One does not. Change happens, and changes impact each of us differently. Leonard Cohen reminds us that the cracks are where the light gets in. However these bowls are used, they can be a connection with the oak tree, with the sun, the rain, the soil, all the beings who have been in the garden for the life of that oak, those who cared for the tree, and all those who were part of the process of change, from acorn to tree to log to wood block to bowl.
We change, nature changes. Sometimes we change things into beautiful other things. Music changes over time too. Earlier, we sang number 21 for the beauty of the earth. As that hymn has changed over time, Maria played a piece with an entirely different tune for the beauty of the earth. And Leah Davis has created a newer variation as well. Some of you have sung this one before. Sometimes change can be a bit easier when we get to try it on first. So let's just try this on together. Even if you've never seen it, you don't sing, you don't know how to read music, you don't need to do any of that stuff. You just have to repeat after me in the octave that works for your voice. The low part, number 1, is the drone. And it's just the first verse over and over again. And Maria's going to help us out with that D chord so we can get that note just right. For the beauty of the earth, for the splendor of the skies, for the love which from our birth over and around us lies. And then it just repeats. For the beauty of the earth, for the splendor of the skies, for the love which from our birth over and around us lies. And then the second part goes like this. Grateful we raise, grateful we praise, grateful we raise, grateful we praise, grateful we raise, grateful we praise. Excellent. And the high part, for those of you with high voices, even if you don't have a high voice, sing it anyway, because it will sound better with all our voices. Sauce we raise, our hymn of praise. Sauce we raise, our hymn of praise. Sauce we raise, our hymn of praise. Excellent. So now you get to pick one of those. 1, 2, or 3. The drone, for the beauty of the earth, for the splendor of the skies. It's the same note over and over again, and trying to get all that breath in there in the middle of it, and then grateful we praise in the middle. And number 3, the high part. We're going to start and we'll layer in those voices. So you could start on one and then move to another if you want, but some of you should stay on part 1. And some of you should stay on part 2 when we add in the third voice, okay? I'll let you decide. And then we'll watch for my fingers 1, 2, or 3 to stop. And the other parts will just keep going, okay? So we can get to hear different kinds of combinations of our voices. if you would, please. Kind of just give us a little bit of that intro part. Here we go. For the beauty of the earth, for the splendor of the skies, for which from our birth over and around us lies. For the beauty of the earth, for the splendor of the skies, for which from our birth over and around us lies. Grateful we raise, 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 which from our birth over and around us lies. The souls we raise, our hymn of praise. The souls we raise, our hymn of praise. Beauty of the earth, splendor of the skies. Grateful we raise, grateful we raise. Souls we raise, our hymn of praise. Which from our birth over and around us lies. Souls we raise, our hymn of praise. Over and around us lies. Beauty of the earth, splendor of the skies. Which from our birth over and around us lies. Beauty of the earth, the splendor of the skies. Which from our birth over and around us lies. Grateful we raise, 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 grateful we raise. Beautiful. Beautiful. Grateful indeed. 1961, 1985. There are some more changes that occurred. This is going to go by quickly. Just my main hope is that you know that there have been changes over time, and each time for the better. In 1995, the General Assembly, GA, we love our acronyms, voted to add a sixth source, spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. I think that was my first GA, actually. In 2009, there were several changes proposed, and all of them were rejected, though it was a very close vote, 573 to 586. The General Assembly had spoken. Clearly, not enough of us wanted so many changes. In 2013, a few of the rejected changes from before are now incorporated into the inclusion statement of our faith. And in 2017, in New Orleans, measures failed and passed. Changing inherent worth and dignity of all people was suggested to be changed to all beings. This change was actually tabled, and no debate was engaged on the day of voting, though there was some procedural hoo-ha to figure out how best to do that within the interminably complex rules of Robert and the rules of the UUA. Changing the second source did pass to be more inclusive, and that conversation held many emotions. There was a particularly moving moment on the day before, and you can actually go find this on the UUA website if you're so moved, when a woman who was part of the 1985 changes spoke at the mic. She noted with sadness that it was very intentionally proposed then and passed to be prophetic women and men. Yet the program book and much of the conversation on the first day of debate noted men and women. An indication of how much it was needed to be the other way around still. She noted, though, that she was completely in favor of this change to move from the binary of women and men to people, but didn't want the history and the significance of that early change to be lost and inaccurately reflected in the minutes. An apology was offered. And the following day on the debate floor, it was stated correctly by everyone, women and men throughout. And changing that second source from women to men required a 4/5 vote of those gathered so that it would become effective immediately rather than have to go through a year of study, because everything in a C bylaw needs 2 years to pass as is. It passed by far more than 4/5 of a vote, and there was great rejoicing in the hall. Some of you were there. Do you remember? Lois was there. Dawn was there. Some other folks were there. Yep, John was there. Kat was there. Kat, were you at that one? 2017 in New Orleans? Several folks rejoiced. There were tears. It was such a beautiful moment in our movement towards inclusion.
In recent years, there has been a grassroots movement in congregations to consider adding an 8th principle. It would read, journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. There are some 200 plus congregations that have engaged in a year-long process to consider whether to pass this within their congregation. And folks who attended Coffee Crullers and Conversation this morning talked a bit about that here today. They have considered what needs to change, the congregations that have voted on it, in order for this principle to be lived out. And some have voted to adopt it, and some have not. And some have not yet engaged with it that much. But with the Article 2 Study Commission, you may notice that some of this language, instead of being added in as an 8th principle, the suggested language has been woven in to the new model of that Article 2 that they're suggesting. And we'll be getting to that in just a moment. But first, let's just pause for a moment and think about how much has changed, and also maybe how much has not changed since 1961. This slide is a recap. The current Article 2 is on the left column. The proposed Article 2 is on the right column. And again, we know you may not be able to see. The arrows show how things are moving, if they are. So the first brilliant thing that the commission did was to put the purposes of the UUA first. For those who see color, the tealish text have similar but reworded concepts in the new updated interpretation. And those in red on the right side are things that are new, things that have been added. There's a couple interesting and important things that have been added. To heal historic injustices, and that the purpose of the UUA is to actively engage its members in transformation of the world through liberating love. That purpose feels exciting and juicy to many of us and is 10 times better than the original proposed language that comes out. Because much like many things here, what's that? Yes, it was better than what was originally, what the Article 2 Study Commission originally proposed. They clearly are listening to the feedback that they are receiving, which is another nudge to give them some more. Wendy and I can see places where they incorporated changes and also places where they chose not to incorporate some changes that had been suggested. We know this because Wendy has spent hours contemplating and participating in their feedback sessions, and at least one of the things that Wendy suggested is there, and at least one of the things stayed just the way that it was. That's how communication and feedback goes. Sometimes we offer feedback and a change happens, and sometimes things can stay the same. Unfortunately, as human beings, sometimes people interpret no change as having not been heard. We know that when feedback is given to us, we do our best to listen to it. We listen carefully. We listen to what is said. We try to also notice what isn't being said. We weigh it against what we know to be true and needed at that time. And then we decide whether or not to incorporate the feedback along with other leaders. Sometimes the interpretation is that we're not hearing the feedback, when in actuality, we just aren't agreeing with it. I would guess that each of you do that sometimes too. Do you ever get feedback and not agree? Maybe. Yeah. Once or twice. We're always making decisions. And often we're giving feedback to others, sometimes whether asked for it or not, and sometimes it's useful, sometimes less so. And in community, we want to strive to listen to one another. And so not responding in agreement doesn't mean that we aren't listening. It does mean that there are many paths forward. Hooray for the many paths. The commission is clearly aware of this in their deep work. They are contemplating and determining to the best of their ability what to incorporate of changes that are being suggested and needing and choosing to reject the rest.
The biggest change is in the next section, and we're going to kind of fly through it, but it's available. You'll see it in the link that we put in circuits. The co-chair, Reverend Cheryl M. Walker, noted earlier, she's a co-chair of the commission, and she noted that we regularly talk about UU values. Our UU values. We're guided by our UU values. We vote with our UU values. But nowhere in any of our organizing documents do we talk about what those values are. Nowhere. So we sort of make some assumptions about what they are. And so they decided, maybe we should ask some people, what do we think those values are? And see what happens. When you contemplate your Unitarian Universalist identity and what it means to you, when you consider why this religious community matters to you, and even if you are here for the first time, some of what you have been hearing, why it might matter to you in your life, what values come to mind? Would you call them out? Love, freedom of thought, equality, humanism, social justice work, democracy, good, community, inclusion. Values, democracy, environment, diversity, stewardship. Thank you. The commission got several of those answered to them as well. And the results were shared with the larger body, and they were distilled down to the ones most commonly named among all the interviews. And now a new path for the bylaws is suggested. Over the course of its work, the commission engaged in 45 feedback sessions with 4,611 total participants. Their videos reached 7,765 viewers. I might have been a couple of those. And their 29 surveys generated a total of 10,925 responses. I was definitely a couple of those. This section begins with a bit of a preamble. So instead of principles, it's now values. And this preamble helps ground us. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant congregation to congregation and through our association to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values are. There was a very basic graphic in the first version, and somebody was inspired to create, yes. In the very basic graphic, there was, so someone sent in one that was sent in this as a response to it, to be like, we don't have to just have boring little circles. We can actually create some art in our process. And that was immediately incorporated by the commission in its report to the Board of Trustees. Reverend Cheryl told us that she hopes that there's a way where this graphic can show up every time you click on the document in a new order with different colors. So that no outside petal is more important than any of the others. That all of these values are central to our faith, particularly with love at our center. Now, several of us are a little concerned about the principles and the sources being lost. But as we fly through these, you may see some places where some of that language shows up, for those of you who are familiar with the language. And for those of you who are new, I ask you to just hold on a little bit while we go through this and consider this place and what we might be facing. Because there are some religious traditions that have stayed pretty much the same their whole existence. And that is okay. We affirm and support other religious traditions to do what they think is right. And we have some responsibility to help shape, co-create as we live into this Unitarian Universalist faith. We are not going to resolve the dilemma between what about the principles and sources? How come their values? We're not here to do that. You can do that on your own, but we're not doing that today. What we are inviting is just some holy curiosity, HOLY and WHOLLY, holy curiosity to try these on. And you can give feedback by April 30th. Okay, next section is a particular format. Each of these words will get named also throughout, but we've got interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, justice, with love at the center. The particular format of these sections, just to orient those of you who can see what we're doing, not reading it all, just to see it. Each word has a brief statement about what the commission means by that word, followed by a statement of covenant. In other words, we as Unitarian Universalists value X, which means this. Therefore, we covenant to be Y and do Z to live out our faith. Again, we're going to go through quickly. We'll put in the link of circuits. This is really good practice for our annual focus of ministry, to notice the differences and how differences can strengthen our connections and commitments as we imagine what is possible for the future of our faith. Let's do it, Lars. Equity. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. Recognize that phrase, yes? Bolded there to notice that's in the first principle currently. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. Value 1 for the purposes of today, but there are no numbers. Remember, they're going to keep changing, we hope, staying on the outside in different places. Next. The secondary slides of each of these values will show you the principles and how they're connected. Next. Interdependence. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. We covenant to cherish Earth and all beings by creating and nurturing relationships of care and respect. With humility and reverence, we acknowledge our place in the great web of life, and we work to repair harm and damaged relationships. Next. You can see how that's connected to our 7th principle. Next. Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions. This one has a lot of overlap in places. Next. We proposed 8th principles connected there. We've got some other places there. Go next for me. You'll see the justice continues. It's connected with principle number 2 and number 6. Next. It continues to be connected with the right of conscience from principle number 5, and the word right of consciousness will appear later in the freedom of belief. Thank you. Next. Generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. Next. Pluralism. We do not have to think and believe alike to love alike. We celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. Next. You'll see the connections to the 4th principle next. Transformation. We adapt to the changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian and Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect. Next. You see how it's connected with our 3rd principle. Connect. Yes, next. Sorry, I didn't mean, you read that right. Again, these are just going to be showing you how she did this great thing with color coding various things. Next. Those are the current principles with the proposed 8th principle. Those colors help remind you that they show up in those values we just noted. Next. Here's a visual graphic for those of you who are more artistically oriented. Again, color coordinated for those of you who can see color to connect with our current principles and where they show up in these values. Next, please. Okay. We've covered a lot of territory in a short amount of time, and we are almost done. Next. The sources are now what's called inspirations. As Unitarian Universalists, we use and are inspired by sacred and secular understandings that help us to live into our values. We respect histories, contexts, and cultures in which they were created and are currently practiced, and it continues from there. And I think they've done a pretty good job incorporating some of the language of the principles, but I find this a little bit more concerning. Anything jump out at you when you read through this? You can put things in the chat, those of you on Zoom, if you anything in here that you're like, what the heck does that mean? Or I don't think that's not a source. What are you talking about? Anything? I am not grateful for all of our religious ancestries. I'm just not. And they're going to find that out from me because I'm going to give them feedback. And you can too, if you think that's true. Next, please. There is already at least one amendment afoot that we know of to change the first sentence to the one up above. As Unitarian Universalists, we proclaim that direct experiences of transcending mystery and wonder are a primary source of inspiration. These experiences open our hearts, renew our spirits, and transform our lives, and then the rest of it stays the same. So there's some people already working on amendments for General Assembly. Next. C2.4, the proposed inclusion. This is only a little bit different from the original. The original is sort of crowded over there on the left-hand side, but it's basically the same words here, except for the ones that are this sort of tealish, bluish color. We welcome all persons who share our values and enhances everyone's participation, especially those with historically marginalized identities. That's pretty significant. It might make a few of us squirm a little bit. Some of it helps us feel a little bit more liberated. Our tendency as Unitarian Universalists is to say, we just welcome everyone. We welcome all beliefs. You can believe whatever you want. But it's not true. You cannot be a member of the KKK and find yourself to be a Unitarian Universalist. Right? We already have some boundaries around who we say we are. There are things you cannot believe and be a Unitarian Universalist. It's just incompatible. So too, it means that we don't have to bend over backwards all of the time to try to make sure everybody feels welcome if they are behaving in ways that are outside of covenant, or have values and beliefs that are different from ours that are harmful to the community. That's a huge shift. Doesn't mean we need to be rude. Doesn't mean we don't get to widen our circle of inclusion. It just means we get to create some healthy boundaries and covenant with one another of how to be in community. And that when we fall short because we are human, and we will, that there's a pathway back or a doorway if you can't come back. Healthy boundaries are good for healthy communities. And prioritizing those with historically marginalized identities has been work we have been hard at work, and it's time to name it in our work together. Freedom of belief, next, please. Mostly the same, just a little adjustment at the very beginning. Now, what's important to note about this is that the whole point is to say the institution cannot tell you what you believe. We don't usually tell each other what to believe. We might get curious and ought to get curious about what we believe, but we don't tell each other what to believe. And congregations may establish statements of purpose, covenants, and bonds of union so long as they do not require that members adhere to a particular creed. And we here share a bond of union, do we not? Thus far. Can I have that next slide? Let us rise in body and our spirit to speak these words together. Often done at the beginning of service, but changes. Would you rise in body and spirit to speak these words? Love is the spirit of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to care for the earth in stewardship, that all may grow in harmony with the good. Thus do we covenant with one another. Has it become a creed? Does this covenant cover all we need it to? Does it need a review after all these years? Change is indeed the only constant in this life. Sometimes we get to choose it. Sometimes it chooses us. We close with these words by our colleague, the Reverend Stephen Protzman. If any of this today has inspired you to want to be a delegate, please talk to Bridget Almus after the service briefly, or contact the board, because there's also a budget forum today, and find out what it is to apply to become a delegate. Stephen Protzman said, when speaking to his congregation about these changes, because services like this are happening all across the country right now, the last couple of months. He says, many of us in this room, including me, have only ever known the 7 principles as a theological statement of what it means to be UU. I've been studying these changes and I'm not sure how I feel. I have questions, and I imagine some of you do as well. Will they help us live into our shared vision of Unitarian Universalism? Will replacing our principles with a statement of values allow us to finally become the inclusive faith we say we want to be? I don't know, he says. What I do know is that whether we change Article 2 or not, love needs to be at the center of our faith. A mature love that calls us to care for one another, especially those who are the most vulnerable and on the margins. To care for our fragile planet. To end the systems of oppression that prevent all of us from living fully. To create peace and true justice. And we agree with him. We agree. Would you go to the new graphic slide for us with the hearts, Lars? Thank you. The purpose, the covenant and values, inspirations, inclusions, and freedom of belief. Leaning into our living tradition. Cynthia has created this new graphic for our consideration for just, there are many ways to interpret these now, right? May we have the courage and at least the curiosity to find out what it will be like if we change and grow and move and lean into maybe some of the nervousness and fear we might have, support one another, and to celebrate some changes together. Amen, and blessed be.